In today's video, we are going to go over what I believe is the absolute most valuable framework you can follow to restore normal arm movement. If you're new to this channel, I'm Tara, I'm a neurologic physical therapist, and on this channel we talk about anything and everything related to mobility, health, fitness, and mindset with the end goal of empowering you with as many tools as possible to take full ownership of your rehab and your overall health. And all that said, in today's video, you're gonna learn why your arm currently isn't moving, and of course, a framework to follow in order to restore normal arm movement. But first, let's just start with two very big picture concepts that are kind of foundational to how our bodies move in general. And that is every joint in our body has an agonist that moves a joint in the direction that we're trying to move. And with every agonist, there is an antagonist. There is a muscle on the opposite side of the joint that's opposing that movement. And when you're setting up your arm rehab program, it's important to understand both the agonist component and the antagonist component. So what can cause an antagonist to resist movement? So for example, if we're trying to straighten our arm, the muscles that straighten the elbow, those are the agonists. The antagonists are the muscles that bend the elbow, the bicep. So sticking with this example, what would cause resistance to that arm being able to extend? So what would cause this bicep muscle to be contracting or to be resisting that motion? One is an involuntary contraction, such as spasticity. What's important to know about spasticity is that it is velocity dependent. So in this example, why that matters is some of you, if you're working on elbow extension, you're using a lot of momentum. Just something important to know is that some of that resistance is coming because you're just moving the arm too fast, and that spasticity is kicking in, that antagonist is contracting because of that involuntary contraction. And for you, you just have to move the arm slower. So that's just a little pro tip, not necessarily part of the framework, but just kind of like a pro tip that, you know, when you're using that momentum, that alone could be the reason why you can't get that voluntary movement that you're looking for. But what else could be resisting that? What else can occur in the bicep that are, you know, the antagonist that's making that elbow to bend? One is just tone. So tone is basically just a term that is used to mean resistance to lengthening. What can cause increased tone? One thing is if your arm stays bent for a long period of time, you just kind of lose a little bit of that elastic component of that bicep. So that will resist, in this case, that elbow from lengthening. So that's a property of the antagonist that'll make relearning how to straighten that arm a little bit more challenging. And if that tone develops, progresses further, you can develop something that we call a contracture. So a contracture is when it's adaptively shortened. That bicep muscle just does not lengthen appropriately, and so therefore you can't get your arm all the way straight. So the way you would identify a contracture is if someone else came over and tried to use their hands to straighten your arm, meaning you're not using your muscles in your arm, but they're trying to straighten it and they can't get it straight, that would probably be a contracture. Now, if it's spasticity, what you might see is that initially they can't get it straight, but then they hold it for about 30 seconds and it feels almost like it releases and then it goes straight. That would probably be more spasticity. So just something important to be able to differentiate spasticity from a contracture or increased tone. The other thing that can be problematic that's kind of related to spasticity, but it does have a little bit of a different cause, and that's abnormal synergy patterns. So some people believe that abnormal synergy patterns are a stage in the recovery process. What an abnormal synergy pattern is when multiple joints link up together. And some people believe that this is hardwired into our brain, meaning we come out of the womb with these ingrained patterns. You see this a lot in infants before they learn how to coordinate movement. They're either all extension or they're all flexion. And infants have other patterns as well. We call those primitive patterns. Evolutionarily, it kind of makes sense to me that before our brains develop, we need some way to kind of get out of danger. So what do babies do? They either extend their whole body to roll from their stomach or their side to their back. And if they want to go from their back to their stomach, they just kind of flex up. And then if you've ever seen those babies on the ground where they're just kind of like flexion, extension, that's kind of how they're scooting across the floor before they learn how to coordinate movement, meaning like crawl or commando crawl, where they can move one limb at a time and they can isolate shoulder joint movement without getting these mass flexion or mass extension patterns. That's coordination. So how does that relate to you? Some people believe that we go through those same stages after a neurologic injury, that we go from flaccid, meaning no movement, to moving in patterns, to moving out of patterns. What happens a lot of times is people get stuck in those patterns. That's important to know when we get to kind of designing your home exercise program. Is if you are moving in patterns, that's great because you're not moving the arm. However, it's problematic if you wanted to try and actually use that movement in a functional activity, right? So babies do it. They use those patterns in functional activities. That's kind of how they scoot across the floor initially or roll from their back to their stomach. But if they tried to crawl, they wouldn't be very successful at it. Now, different infants from adults, the difference is a baby will just kind of move on, you know, work on something else or try and do it another way. As adults, why that matters is because when you think you can perform a coordinated movement, you immediately want to go try it with a functional activity, and then you're not successful. It can be very, very frustrating. So many of you need to be focused on working out of synergy patterns. Like a good example of this is shoulder flexion. Many times is linked up with this pattern that includes elbow flexion. So many of you think, well, I can get my arm up and it's so great, so great. But you get frustrated because if you went and tried to reach for something, that's shoulder flexion with elbow extension, and you can't do it, it gets very frustrating. So it is important to know, are you using patterns? And make sure you remember that, because it's going to make some of the exercises that I talk about make a little bit more sense. But that's one consideration or one thing you need to think about when you are designing your home exercise program. Am I moving in patterns or am I starting to move out of patterns? And then of course, like, movement is great, but if it's not ever practiced in conjunction with a functional activity, it's going to be very hard to do that movement when you are doing that functional activity. So what do I mean by that is, you know, you could take an elite athlete, like let's take a gymnast for example, and they do drill after drill after drill, and this is actually kind of how they practice, is they'll do 50 of a skill on a piece of equipment, and they'll just do it over and over and over and over again. But if they never put that skill into an actual routine, and they just went onto the competition floor and thought, well, I hit 50 of this skill in the gym, no problem, I'm going to be able to do this skill in my routine, they have a very much lower probability of being successful because they've never done that skill in the routine. Same thing happens, is being able to do a movement is one thing, but being able to do that movement in the necessary conditions for that movement to be functional is something completely different. Okay, so now what does all of that mean? Well, it means that when you are designing your home exercise program, or even a single session within a much longer plan, there must be some component where you have addressed proper lengthening of the antagonist. You have to make sure you've done everything in your power to decrease as much resistance as possible to that movement you're trying to get. You want to do everything in your power to make sure that that bicep is relaxed, right? If you're working on arm extension, and that it has the proper elastic properties that it can lengthen in that direction. So a goal, long-term goal, should be getting full range of motion back in that arm towards extension passively. How do you know what full range of motion is? Your other arm is your textbook, right? So that's important. Make sure you have full range of motion. That means at the beginning of each session, making sure you're stretching everything to make sure you have adequate length, but then also as one of your goals should be, if you don't have full range of motion, to get that full range back. Now, the reason I brought up the abnormal synergy patterns is it's also extremely important that you can do isolated joint movement. If you can't do isolated joint movement, for example, you're trying to work shoulder flexion, but your arm is internally rotated in this position, that's most likely a pattern. And it's going to be very frustrating when you try, like I said earlier, to reach. So the second most important critical component of an arm rehab program is, can you do isolated, uncoupled joint movements? So that means pure shoulder flexion with nothing else going on at the elbow and the wrist. Pure abduction with nothing else going on at the shoulder and the wrist. Pure external rotation with nothing else going on at the shoulder and the wrist. Pure elbow extension without the palm turning down. That is a synergy, an extensor synergy pattern. When that palm turns down, that is a synergy pattern. That's why in many of the exercises I have on this channel, especially for the arm, I'm very specific at which direction your palm should be facing. So sticking with elbow extension in this direction, your palm should always be kind of facing towards your head. Okay, so whether your hand's up here and you're doing it here, which I do think that you should do elbow extension with your shoulder at different positions. In all of those positions, you should be able to look at your hand and see your hand. You should not be looking at the back of your hand. That's if you're really trying to get full, normal, functional movement back in your arm. If you're in the early stages and you're just trying to activate, and I do this with some people, I don't care what position the hand is in, the forearm, if it's pronated or supinated, if they have no movement, if you have no movement towards elbow extension, of course you can use a pattern initially to get that movement back. But if you're beyond that, that position of that palm is very important to get that isolated joint movement. Okay, so the other considerations that need to go into designing your home exercise program for restoring normal arm movement is, what position is your body in when you're doing the motion? There's gravity assisted. So you would want to get your body in a position, if you're in the very, very early stages, where you're using gravity to help you. Gravity assisted is the motion is going towards the floor. Gravity eliminated is you're going parallel to the floor. So gravity is out of the picture. And then against gravity is the movement is occurring away from the floor. So that's number one for the arm. So the other important factor is your trunk position. So laying flat is an easier position for a couple of reasons. One is it stabilizes the shoulder blade. So why is that important? Many of you have heard me give this example before, but the shoulder blade is actually part of the shoulder joint. And if that is moving all over the place, like for example, if you have a lot of weakness around the muscles that stabilize that shoulder blade, it's going to make it less efficient or harder to move this bone. The example I give a lot is if you're standing on a floating dock in the water that's not attached to anything, and you're holding a rope that's attached to a boat and you're trying to move that boat through the water and you're standing on that floating dock, is that going to be easier or harder than if you were standing on a solid surface and trying to pull that boat through the water? Obviously, it's easier to be standing on a solid, firm ground to move that boat through the water. Same thing here. If the origin of the muscles and the attachment of the muscles are both on kind of moving objects, then it's going to make it a little bit more challenging to move that arm bone. So that's why starting laying down is a better position. Also, it has something to do with like the length tension relationship of the muscles and their reference to like the force of gravity. There's a lot of reasons why that laying down is just an easier position to initially get that shoulder motion. So your trunk position is very important. Now, as soon as you go to sitting up, okay, that does make it a lot harder. One is because you got multiple moving parts, right? So Going from laying down to sitting up is a very, very big jump. So you could sit in a recline, or you can position yourself in an inclined position. That's going to be harder than laying down, but easier than sitting all the way up. So take that into consideration, is that this is an underutilized position, laying in kind of a reclined position in that process of restoring that arm movement. Very, very, very important. Now, what motions do I think are the most valuable to start with? Shoulder flexion, elbow extension, very, very important with the palm up, not using that synergy pattern, palm up, and external rotation, going isolated out in this direction. Okay, why? Because that's an important component of restoring full shoulder range of motion. Your arm bone is actually externally rotated a little bit in order to get that full range of motion. But more than that, most people have extremely tight or sometimes even spastic pectoralis muscles, which pull that bone into internal rotation. And so by activating the external rotators, there's some potential that you're going to inhibit this pec muscle as well. So very, very important is that external rotation. Okay, so just to kind of keep us all on track, you're going to have something where you're stretching the muscles that are resisting the motion that you're trying to do. The activation component, you want to make sure you can isolate joint movement to ensure that you're not using an abnormal synergy pattern, which is important when you actually want to put that motion into practice. And then finally, you've got lengthening, you got mobility, you got activation, and then the final component of your long-term plan, but also within each plan, is attaching it to a function. So what does that mean? It means doing something purposeful. Our brains do a much better job of learning something if that movement is attached to some sort of a purpose. And yeah, it's great that you can do that movement, but unless you're practicing that movement in the skills that you actually want to be able to do that movement in, you're going to be extremely frustrated, and the likelihood of you being able to use that new movement functionally are much lower. So you could say brushing your hair is a functional skill. So laying on your back, reaching up, strap a brush to your hand if you need to, and you're reaching for your head, right? Reaching into a cabinet. Put something overhead where you can reach up and kind of manipulate that, right? If you want to open a door, same thing. We haven't really fully gotten into the full conditions yet, but the point is that you're attaching it to some sort of a function, and then once you can successfully do it, then you would go to sitting up, then you would go to incorporating an actual door potentially to that. But being able to visualize, okay, I can do this shoulder movement, but visualize it, attaching it to a skill, just know that you can also grade that condition to set yourself up for success while you're in the learning process. So is this brushing your hair? Technically, no, because you're not rarely brush your hair laying down, but it is the beginning stages of incorporating a new movement into a functional activity. I like the idea of just strapping a brush to your hand because that just further solidifies to your brain that this is a functional movement. Now, one other thing that I think is super important that I talk about quite a bit, but it's always worth repeating, if you try 3 times and you're unsuccessful 3 times, downgrade the activity. Either change your position or change the direction of that movement, because after that, you are just reinforcing to your brain that you cannot perform this movement. So very, very, very important. If you try 3 times and you're unsuccessful, downgrade or make that movement easier. Hopefully that was a good framework that you guys can follow. If you are someone that's trying to restore arm movement, I highly, highly recommend the shoulder flex. The shoulder flex is a device that works on stretching external rotation. Now, full disclosure, They do support this channel, but I reached out to them when I saw this product. It's literally the only product on the market where you can self-stretch towards external rotation without your elbow flaring out to the side. So I'm a huge advocate of being able to self-manage many of your symptoms to decrease the amount of time you have to spend in therapy or to increase the things that you can do to help yourself outside of therapy. And I think the shoulder flex is absolutely essential part of that toolkit to work on external rotation without that elbow flaring out to the side. So if it is something you're interested in or you want to learn more about it, I will put a link in the description below. By clicking on that link, we do receive a small commission. And if it is something you're interested in, I thank you in advance for your support. That is it for this video. I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you did, and you're new to this channel, and you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell so that you will get notified every time I upload new videos. I enjoyed spending time with y'all today, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good day.